the challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. The evangelical fundamentalist movement has seemed to be a monolith of Christians embracing conservative politics. But news and social media sources have increasingly been documenting rifts in the movement. Ex-evangelical and post-evangelical are both growing Facebook pages, friended by those disillusioned by what they term extreme right-wing politics. One of our guests today, a former Southern Baptist minister, never thought those terms would apply to him. But that was before he met a young Muslim boy in a North Carolina coffee shop. The gentleman I just spoke of is sitting immediately to my right, and that is Dr. Jeff Burns, who is visiting us from North Carolina. Yes. Welcome, Jeff, and from an organization known as Pathways to Peace. Yes. And we'll be hearing much more of that. And if you've watched these programs at all frequently, you're very familiar with the lady who's gracing us right now, and that is Aneelah Afzali from MAPS Amen, Muslim Association of Puget Sound and American Muslim Empowerment Network. Aneelah, thank you so much for coming back again.
Thank you for having us.
Well, it's a delight. And what I'd like to do is, I gave an allusion to your story in the introduction, Jeff. What I'd like to do is go back 16 plus years ago. At that time, having the conversation that you and Aneelah are about to have would have been, I think it's fair to say, inconceivable. Can you give us a sense of what emotional, what intellectual place you were in at that time?
Yes, I can. I would say emotionally, I was a burnout fundamentalist pastor. Evangelical, but I was burnout. I had been a pastor for 18 years. 12 of those were, I was a Southern Baptist minister. And I was a graduate of Liberty University, familiar with Liberty University. And in fact, Jerry Falwell Jr. lived across the hall from me. We were 18-year-old, boys then. And so pastored Baptist churches for 12 years, then 7 years interdenominational churches. But dealt with the racial issue was very big, big struggle. Found out later that one of the churches that I had pastored, half my leadership had been in the Ku Klux Klan at one time. So we spent so much energy dealing with that issue, and I was burnt out. And the interdenominational church was a good experience. That was a good experience. But I got tired of convincing people to love their neighbor. I mean, really, bottom line, don't get me wrong, there were some wonderful people, and I had some wonderful parishes that I led. But I was burnt out by this time, and so I quit. I left. I said, I can't do this anymore. I didn't sign up for this. I thought we were following Jesus, and little did I know that even though I had fought the racial battle, I was a racist in my heart. My wife pointed out later towards Muslims. Somehow, it's amazing how we can compartmentalize. And so intellectually, I was a part of this movement called Christian Zionism. Are you familiar with that term, Christian Zionism?
I know you are
familiar with it.
For our audience.
So when I was a Baptist and interdenominational, we all were Christian Zionists, the ideology, and we got it from our fundamentalist roots. Basically, Christian Zionism says that Jesus can't come back until all the lands that Israel once had are reestablished, but primarily they focus on the West Bank and the Gaza. So all the Palestinians have to leave, then Jesus can come back and the kingdom will come, and so we bought into that ideology intellectually. But the problem with that ideology is that if you just look at the Old Testament, that land goes all the way to Jordan, all the land they're supposed to have.
Right.
But in the West, we were thinking West Bank and Gaza, West Bank and Gaza. So there was no space in my heart intellectually to love Jews and to love Muslims. You said, it created a real conflict. Now I tell people, because I get accused of being anti-Semitic now, which I'm not, I love Jewish people. I've spoken in synagogues, and I have many Jewish friends, but I just made room in my heart to love Muslims. But back then, I was in that space of Christian Zionism, fundamentalism, but I was burnt out. So I was a prime candidate for God to show up.
And we're going to talk about that story. Aneelah, you've heard countless stories similar to the one that Jeff just related of where he was 16 years ago. Is there a common denominator to each of those stories?
Yeah, oftentimes what it involves is people who don't know their Muslim neighbors, right? They have no personal connections, they don't have the personal stories, they don't know much about Islam. That's what studies show us, that the majority of our fellow Americans do not know Muslims personally and do not know much about Islam. And that is a recipe for disaster when you have certain groups and individuals who are promoting a very divisive, sort of hateful message, a message of fear, and often used as propaganda even, that creates this divide between we the people. So Muslims in this narrative are treated as the other. And that lends itself to fear and sort of concern and that distance that does not allow people to even have these kinds of personal interactions that would otherwise counter the misinformation that people are often fed. So that seems to be the common denominator, is that lack of connection and then a little bit of sort of lack of knowledge about the religion, the faith, or the people.
Exactly.
Those two together, and an unwillingness to change, an unwillingness to sort of meet people or have their viewpoints challenged in any way. And I've seen it with many people. Dr. Jeff Burns is one example, but I've encountered so many people in the work that I do, and also others that I've read about across our country who were in a place of hate, in a place of fear, in a place of concern. And it was a personal connection, whether it's a 5-year-old child, whether it's another human being, whatever it is, that one personal connection can create a powerful transformative, it can have that kind of powerful transformative impact.
And you mentioned that impact of an encounter, and that's going to lead us into the next story. Jeff, your mindset, as we know now, obviously changed, and it changed from what I understand because of an encounter with a very young lad, and we're going to love this in the Seattle area, in a Starbucks coffee shop, albeit in North Carolina. Tell us about that encounter. Take us back then and explore that.
Well, it's interesting. When I left the pastoral ministry in 2004, I was like, what am I going to do now with my life? I've got all my education and I've done all this for 18 years. And I got an email in 2004. This is just 3 years after 9/11. Yeah, 3 years after 9/11. And I was invited to be a part of a class for 3 months on Islam. And they were going to bring in Muslim speakers, Christian speakers. They're going to have everything, missionaries, non-missionary. I mean, just anybody that's had some connection with Islam.
Right.
And to grow. I had books for us to read, and you read Muslim books, Christian books. And I said, I'm embarrassed to say it now, but I said it'll be a cold day in hell before I go spend 3 months studying about Islam. I know everything I need to know. And they kept writing, but we need you to come. You are an influential pastor in our area, and we want you to come and be a part of this. And I said, no, I'm not coming. I don't want anything to do with this. And my wife, she's a very straightforward person, wonderful person, Oceana. She said, you fought the racial battle in the South, but when it comes to Muslims, you're a racist in your heart. Oh, I was so offended. But I couldn't sleep over that, And I said, well, I'll take that class. When Jesus Christ appears at the foot of my bed and asks me to take it, I'll take it. But I want to see his ID for confirmation. I was being a smart butt. So I was a hard case, is what I'm trying to say. And so finally I thought, well, all right, I don't want to look like I'm not open. So I took the class. And all of a sudden realized, wow, Islam is not a monolithic thing. Well, neither is evangelicalism. It's easy to all of us to think monolithically. It's a lot of diverse. I thought, well, Islam is very diverse. You got Sufis, you got Sunni, you got Shia, you've got all this. I mean, it's as diverse as Christianity. And I thought, okay, well, I'm a little more enlightened, and but this is as far as it goes. I'm not going to, because I hated Muslims. And I would have never said that out loud because Christians are not supposed to hate anybody. But in my heart, I just, and I said, but this is as far as it goes. And they said, well, in order to get credit for this class, you have to go make friends with a Muslim and go down into the mosque with a group to one of the dawah or, the outreach presentations. And I was like, oh, God, no. I would rather have a colonoscopy. I don't want to do this. Lord, what?
That's a bit extreme.
It was. I was like, no. And it's like God was just pushing me towards way outside my comfort zone. But I tell people, coming from a Southern Baptist background, I wanted to get my certificate. They say, you want to get credit? I always read the certificate. So to make a long story short, there's a long story. I was halfway through the class. I was sitting at a Starbucks on Creedmoor Road in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I was wrestling. I don't know if you've ever had something in your life that keeps you awake at night, your stomach's, and this was one of those things. And I remember sitting there at Starbucks, and I said, we had a class manual open and like the hijab. I mean, now it's a beautiful thing. But then I'm like, what do you do with this? And the men with the beards and the skull cap. And I said, Lord, look at me. I'm a Southern, guy. And I said, the bridge between Islam and Christianity is so large. How do you, I said, surely you're not asking me to do something about this. That thought hit me. I thought, oh no, surely this struggle is not about that. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to put God on test God, so to speak. So I just looked around, made sure nobody was watching me, and I just shot up a prayer. I had my cappuccino in my hand, and I said, okay, God, and this is how simple the prayer was. Here's the deal. If you're calling me to build bridges of love and peace to the house of Ishmael, to the Muslim community, you're going to have to give me a sign so clear I'll never, ever, 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 ever doubt it. And I thought, I'm off the hook. Because Baptists don't believe in signs. So I felt great. I went back to the manual and I was having this wonderful experience. And then this, next thing I know, this little boy standing right next to my table. I'm not kidding, a minute didn't pass. And God knew the way to my heart was through a child. Because we love children. My wife and I always loved children. Every ministry we were in, we poured everything into children. And so he was standing there, and I had these magic markers out. And the kids would come over all the time wanting one of the magic markers. And he said, sir, I'd like to borrow one of your magic markers. And I said, sure, take one. He goes, I said, take the blue one. He goes, no, I prefer the orange one. And I thought he would go on his way. Now, I had just prayed for a sign, right? And next thing you know, he pulls up a chair in a Starbucks. And you know how the little round tables are. And he got on his knees. He was so little. And he had his elbows on the table. And he takes the lid off. And he looks me square in the eye. And he said, sir, my name is Omar. And I'm 5 years old. And I'm here to teach you Arabic. And then he reached over and ripped out a piece of paper out of my notebook and started saying the Arabic alphabet out as loud as he could. I mean, he was so excited. And I was like, oh, what is going on? And it was almost like God was whispering to my heart saying, you didn't think I could do that, did you? And I thought I was going to pass out. I was so overwhelmed by this. And then this woman yells and says, Omar, what are you doing? Leave that poor man alone. And I said, no, ma'am, Omar can do whatever he wants to do. And so Omar, for the next 20, 30 minutes, tried to teach me Arabic. And then, of course, he's 5 years old. He's not a calligrapher, okay? He said, now, I write it, you write it. I thought it looked at least as good as his. He's 5. And he goes, it's all wrong. He goes, I'm going to come around there and take your hand and guide you through this alphabet. And so Omar came over and he said, say it with me, each letter, and we wrote it out. And when we got to the end of it, all that hate and poison and Islamophobia, it was gone. It was literally like God took it out of me. And I went to his mother and I said, Omar's going to be a great teacher one day. And she goes, well, we're shocked. And I said, why? Omar is an extremely shy child. He would never go up to a total stranger. And we've been sitting here trying to figure out what made him get up and come over to you. Well, I wasn't ready to talk about it. But I walked out that door that day and I said, God, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm in. Yeah. I'm willing to commit the rest of my life to this. And so and after that, everything changed. So, yeah.
Powerful example of encounter, and you've spoken of that before. Is that power of an encounter such as what Jeff experienced central to opening people to each other? Has that been your experience?
My experience has been that that's the most powerful way to open people. It's not the only way, of course. Facts and stats and data work for some folks. Personal stories work for others. Reading about the religion or learning about the faith works for others. Reading the Quran works for others. So there's different ways to do it, but the personal encounter is just the most profound, the most transformative. Some of the biggest changes that we've seen have been through these kinds of personal encounters. In fact, Ted Hakey Jr., who I've talked about before and I had the chance to meet in person, he was somebody who hated Muslims and even promoted violence against Muslims, and then one day took his rifle and followed his own advice and shot into a next door mosque. And that mosque forgave him for what he did. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. It was 2 a.m. But then he went back to that mosque and he spoke with the community there. And he told them sort of his story, and he even said something to them that still sticks to me. He said, if I had spent 5 minutes with you, I would not have done what I had done. So 5 minutes of that personal encounter would have had all that kind of transformative impact that people would have stayed away from violence, from hate crimes, from what this kind of fear and this propaganda leads people to ultimately do. Because it's really a dehumanization process is what's happening, is there's this whole entire dehumanization machinery that's at play against Muslims and other communities, but certainly against Muslims in our country today. And part of that dehumanization, in fact, is to treat Muslims as other. Which ignores reality, which ignores factual history, which ignores our, African American Muslim siblings who've been part of our country since the very beginning. There are American Muslims who trace their lineage here in our country back to the very founding of our country. And in fact, there were Muslim explorers even before Columbus to what we call the United States of America. And there are estimates that with the slave trade, there were up to 30% of the human beings who were enslaved from Africa having been Muslim.
So when you talk about the power of encounter, and you talked about other elements too, Aneelah, in the work that you do with MAPS Amen and in a variety of different outreach roles, how have you utilized those to try to bridge some of these differences then?
Yeah, part of what we try to do is get people to actually meet their Muslim neighbors for this very reason. Because you can have that profound impact when you realize, oh, we have a lot in common. We both enjoy, for me, snowboarding, for instance, or whatever it may be, right? You can find these commonalities, or cooking, or walking, or reading, whatever it may be. So those opportunities for people to come together and actually meet their Muslim neighbors. Another thing is to go and talk to people about what is happening with this anti-Muslim industry. There's an entire industry that spends millions upon millions of dollars every year in order to spread this kind of fear and divisiveness and divide we the people. And they profit politically and financially, but it hurts us, everyday people, right? So we help people understand that. And then really the best way is to use videos, to use stories, to use personal contacts, to use these opportunities to just help build those personal relationships. That's what I do in the work that I've been doing for the past several years now, and I've been able to witness the direct change. I've had people come up to me, admit to me that they feared me, that they feared Muslims, that they believed the misinformation, and admit that to me. I've had people cry to me, because they felt so bad that they allowed themselves to be filled with that much fear and hate. And they've given me a hug and said that the 2 hours that we had that program, for instance, or whatever it could be, that changed their life.
Jeff, after your encounter with a young boy, you're finishing the coursework. I think you said that was about halfway through. Led you to some other encounters, but you were sort of left with one foot at least tentatively in your old background within evangelical movement, and another foot in the Islamic community and in those Christians and other people of faith that were moving toward some sort of connection. How difficult was that to maintain, and what did it result in?
First it was very hard. I mean, because it's like I was a newborn baby. It really was. Right. My wife she was fine from the beginning. So what we did was, my wife and I started building friendships. I said, we went to the Dawah presentation. That was part of the class thing we had to do. Went down, and there was this brilliant physicist, and he was teaching. And I was, by then all the fear was gone, and I felt like God said, I want you to go up and tell him you want to become friends. And I said, hey, I don't have any Muslim friends. Can we be friends? Sure. And it began an amazing journey. So that was my start. So he became like a surrogate family member to us. And we could sit down. Once we became good friends eating together, we could talk about the hard questions. Explain jihad to me. And he would ask me questions, explain that. And we began, it was so powerful. It was really kind of a training ground. So I spent the first year listening, just as a learner, because I had been so the other way. So what happened was I wrote an article. He asked me one day what I thought about the Prophet Muhammad, and he said, would you write an article from a Christian perspective on the Prophet Muhammad? And it's been published in Muslim newspapers and stuff, and he was so moved by it, and he goes, the mosque wants to know, could they hand it out? And would you come to an open house to hand it? I said, sure. Man, my evangelical friends thought I was going too far. I was part of a network at that time of house churches and intentional communities. And they said, you can't do this, you can't do this. And so my wife looked at me one day and she said, Jeff, you can't talk to our friends about this right now. You and I have to do this and let it grow quietly. Not that we're hiding, but we're going to have to keep doing it, and God will send others. So I went down, and they handed out the article, And the Muslim leaders came up and said, "You're forever in our heart, what you wrote about the Prophet Muhammad." And so my wife and I were doing this, and so I stopped sending out emails to all my church, all these people. And then one day I got this idea. I said, if I was in the shower, it's funny how you get these ideas in the shower, and I felt like God wanted me to start a peace community. And that would just focus on loving Muslims, peacemaking, and I screen people coming in. Yeah, you really do. And so we started out with about 18 people, and I would just start taking them to the mosque. You know, getting them, and so let's go to Friday prayer, and it had a nice cafeteria. Let's go eat. We'll have Muslim. We'll talk. Just talk, and that little community just started loving Muslims, and whatever, you know. One guy taught ESL. He said, "Hey, this is the way I can love." Another guy said, "I like to hunt and fish." I said, "Take Muslims hunting and fishing." It became free, and it was just amazing. What came out of that, and so I was asked. There's a prominent evangelical leader in the city of Raleigh. He said, "Jeff, what you're doing, I'm for it, but I can't support you directly, but I can get you in front of people." He got me in front of a group of pastors one day, and I told my story, what was happening, and at the end of it, 7 of them stayed behind. The rest of them walked out mad. And one of them, he's this beautiful African American man, and he looked at me and said, "When you first started talking, I wanted to run out of here." I said, "How dare they bring this heretic and liberal in?" But he said, "Everything you said comes out of the Sermon on the Mount." It's out of the words of Jesus. He goes, "Have I become a Christian that's offended by the words of our master?" Right. And so they got behind me. But what I did was, I knew they still needed some work. So we meet every 2 weeks in a restaurant. We called ourselves the Friends of Ishmael. And every 2 weeks, I kind of walked them through deconstruction. And we did this over a period of a year. It all takes time. It all takes time. And they become my greatest allies. And then their churches got involved, and then we started an internship of this. And so every year we have 30 or 40 people go through this and just educating about Islam and take them to the mosque. And then we formed small groups called Communities of Reconciliation. It's gone all over the world. This little simple template that another guy created. And it changed things. It just made the biggest difference. And so that's how we did it. But at the same time, we had a lot of we had this resistance.
Well, and that brings up a point. When we see how the evangelical community, or at least what we popularly think of it as, has taken a very large role in elections. They're typically associated with very conservative causes, very often white nationalism, anti-mainstream science, climate change, to name just a couple of things. Is that accurate? Is the reality more nuanced? And to the degree that it is accurate, do you see evidence of change?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. And I always try to be careful about making things black and white. But it is a reality that the present political climate we have now would not be in existence without the evangelical community. And coming from a fundamentalist background, which I'm no longer a part of the fundamentalist background, of course, I went to Liberty University. I would have to say there is a very clear buy-in agenda. You know what I mean? It's homophobic. We had 5 things that we were taught. I found my old moral majority card the other day from the 80s. So the movement began. You know, we had to stop the militant homosexual movement. Protect Israel. That was the other one. National security, which now, back then didn't, but now involves Muslims. You know what I mean? So that's where they fall in. Abortion, prevent abortion, but it's okay to carpet bomb a city if it's, you know what I mean, kill babies already inside and outside the womb. There's a schizophrenia there. And the climate change issue, they don't want to acknowledge, a lot of them do not want to acknowledge climate change. And here's why. They'll say, well, the Earth's always got warmer and colder. And that part's true. I mean, the North Carolina coast 8,000 years ago was 60, 70 miles out, you know, further. But there's natural, what we call, that part's true. But we are accelerating it. You know, there's definite, the carbon footprint is creating a problem. They don't want to acknowledge that because there's an ideology behind that. Well, the world's going to be destroyed anyway, so why should, you know what I mean? And it's dualistic. I'm separate. I have this right sets of beliefs. You're in, I'm in, you're out. Here's how the world is, and Jesus is going to straighten it out, so why save it? You know, it's all going to burn. But on the other side, you've got, I call them progressive evangelicals, and they were a younger group coming up, the millennials, under 50, a lot of them. they're coming up and they're not buying into the party line, you see. So I don't know what's going to be created from there. It might even be a whole nother, it's like in Islam. You know what I'm saying? There's the extremes, and then there's this, and then you just see these beautiful, beautiful things coming up that I think are going to make a difference. But right now, it's scary. It really is, yeah.
Aneelah, I know that you've had connections with those of conservative faith backgrounds or conservative politics. When you make connections in those communities or with those communities, have you found some common elements that you think might be helpful to those trying to make those connections that you might suggest as examples?
Yeah, what I try to focus on in those communities in particular, sort of more conservative communities, is the importance that they're not doing me a favor. They're not doing this for the sake of Muslims necessarily, although that's great if they did it for that reason, but they don't have to go out there and try to help a community that they don't know or necessarily want to know. What I try to really emphasize to them is do what your faith commands you to do. Right, you mentioned the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
Examples of that. So using their own tradition, do what you're doing because it's what your faith commands you to do. It's what our shared American values command us to do. We have to stand for religious freedom for all. That's a core value that we should share, because when we ensure my religious freedom, it also supports your religious freedom.
Well, it's my hope that as people have watched and listened to both of you, that they'll take this message to heart. And I think the other message, that change is possible. Our hearts can change, our behavior can change, and I thank you both for being such a prime example of that and for joining us. And I know North Carolina is a long distance away from Seattle. You come back, I hope you'll be a guest and join us again sometime.
I would be honored to come.
And Aneelah, that invitation is always open to you as well.
Thank you for
so
always
much.
having us on. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
It's an honor.
Thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Challenge 2.0. We hope you'll join us again next week. Thank you.